That the motion be agreed to. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am taking a call on this bill to signal that Labor will not be supporting this bill. We will be opposing it vehemently, and we will continue to oppose it through all stages in this House. The reason is very simple, Mr Speaker. There is simply no justification for this legislation. The Minister has just given the pep that we've become accustomed to hearing when it comes to this situation. And Mr Speaker, I just want to put on the record the very shoddy nature of the consultation period that went with this legislation. This was a piece of legislation that the government has known is going to be required since they last cancelled elections in Canterbury. They had 3 years to get their act together, but instead we had rushed process with submitters having barely enough time to submit, let alone make their voices heard at the table. And Mr Speaker, this simply is not good enough. And this was made very clear to the members of the Local Government and Environment Select Committee who sat through those hearings in Christchurch. And I would have thought that Christchurch-based government members of that committee should hang their heads in shame that they were part of a process that silenced the people of their region on such a fundamental issue such as their democratic rights. Now, Mr Speaker, I have said we are opposing this bill. The reason is very clear. There is no justification. So I want to go through some of the reasons that we have heard about why it is required that we once again cancel elections in part of our country. First of all, the Minister, Nick Smith, came out and said democracy was simply too risky. Well, this is a very surprising sentence to hear uttered from the mouth of an elected representative. I think the people in Nelson should be very interested to know that their member considers that democratic elections are just fundamentally risky business and is something that should be feared. We've just had the Minister tout the other line that is sometimes heard, that such an abrupt change in leadership just can't be had. So we can only have some of the people elected. Well, Mr Speaker, there is absolutely no logical basis for this comment. In both this House and in local bodies, we go through elections every 3 years in other parts of the country, except Canterbury, that is. And that there could well be a whole turnover of councils or of parties going out. This is the stuff of democracy. It happens. And Mr Speaker, that is why organisations have staff. Staff are very good at continuing the work streams that the new elected members want to see continued as passed on. This is simply a bogus argument with absolutely no logical or intellectual merit and is beneath anyone to advance as a case for having this bill in place. We then had earlier on another justification. Well, it's just like the DHBs. Well, two answers to that. Look what the government's doing to DHBs around the country at the moment and see if that is an organisation that this government wants to hold up in some kind of esteem. And the second, it's illogical. It bears no resemblance. DHBs are responsible for the disbursement and the governance of centrally collected tax money. Regional councils are not. And this is where it gets to the crux, that this is about a very basic point about representation following along with taxation. Ratepayers in Canterbury do not have that most fundamental of protection of no taxation without proper representation. And this simply is not good enough. And then we have the other one, we had to be done. That the regional council that was in place in 2010 before they were sacked was simply so bad that the government had to come along and save the environment. That's one that we often hear trotted out by members of this government. Well, that is simply wrong and bears no basis in fact. Any scrutiny of the facts does not bear up to that assertion. Let's have a look. When we had the commissioners who came in and said they were going to set for a target of 80% of Canterbury water, rivers and lakes to be swimmable by 2015. This was their target, the new commissioners. They were already at 74% when they set this target in 2010. That's what our elected representatives had delivered us before they were sacked in 2010. But the commissioners come in and they say, no, we're going to do it better. We're going to make it 80%. Well, Mr. Speaker, today in Canterbury, 67% of our rivers and lakes are swimmable. That we have seen a decline in water quality in our region. So anyone who has the audacity to stand in this House and say that we have seen environmental improvement because of this regime is simply not right. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's not just us in Labour that get a little bit het up about this piece of legislation, that we had submitter after submitter. In fact, the Minister said there were 1,167 submissions received on this legislation. 1,152 submissions opposed this legislation. There was an overwhelming opposition to this legislation. We had the Christchurch City Council, who labelled the government's move in this area as extraordinarily arrogant and said that Canterbury deserved more. And I agree with our elected Christchurch City Council that we in Canterbury do deserve more. We don't deserve to be controlled by government appointees by Wellington. We deserve to elect our representatives. There is no justification for treating Canterbury any differently than the rest of the country. When we have the Minister stand there and say that it's part of a transition back. Well, we heard that when the first legislation was put in place in 2010. They then broke the promise and enacted another piece of legislation in 2013, and here we are in 2016. And I have no faith in those members opposite, if God forbid they're still in government in 2019, that they won't still extend it. And why do I think that? Because MPI were lobbying in cabinet papers to have this as a permanent situation. Parts of government, this government does not want to ever give Canterburyans their vote back, and they have made that very clear. So have no faith that this is a transitional arrangement. You look back in the Hansard and you see the words transitional arrangement all through the 2013 legislation. So beware any falsehoods that are spoken on the other side. We had a very good submission from the Law Society when they came, and they gave a very considered and sophisticated submission. And they said that the proposed further suspension of full democracy is inconsistent with core constitutional values. The justification for the proposed mixed model governance structure is not sufficiently convincing, and the need for the continuance of appointed commissioners has not been demonstrated. And Mr. Speaker, this cuts to the core of why we cannot and will not support this legislation. There is no justification. There is no need. No one has made a case, and I'm looking forward to hearing one made on the floor in this House today. There's plenty of government members who sit on that committee who I'm interested to hearing long and full contributions of the justification to the people and their electorates why it is their votes should be taken away from them. Because, Mr. Speaker, for elected representatives to do this is simply reprehensible. There is no justification for it. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity at this second reading to acknowledge one submission that was made, and that was made by Christina Loughton, a Christchurch woman who has long time been an activist and has spoken very passionately on a number of issues. Christina has since died since she made that submission, but she made her views very clear. She made it clear that she saw this as an affront to her and her fellow Cantabrians. She made it clear that she found this yet another arrogant and out-of-touch move from a government that is intent on keeping power and not considering ordinary people. I ask government members, and particularly the Canterbury-based government members of that committee, to vote with their conscience, to realise what they are doing to the people of their region and do the most basic thing an elected member can do, and that is stand up for democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.